on the live stream. So after those introductory remarks, we want to dive right in and start talking about ethics. So why care about ethics? I guess in some ways, this should not require a justification. We should care about ethics because we're nice people. But let's dig into this a little bit more. So I think often when you hear discussions about ethics in computational social science, they're fear-based motivations. So in the history of science, researchers have done bad things before, and there is a concern that more bad things might happen, and that these bad things could have an even bigger impact. So as one person has said, we don't want the Tuskegee syphilis study on internet scale. We don't. Now, there are other reasons as well to think a little bit more about ethics, and I would call these hope-based reasons. And so what I mean by that is we now have an opportunity to do lots of social good, and I think there are a lot of important things that we could be doing that we are not currently doing because of ambiguity about ethics. Not that these things are unethical, it's just that there is a ambiguity, there's grayness about what is and isn't appropriate, and so that's preventing a lot of things from happening. So let me give you an example of this. During the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, so Ebola is a person-to-person infectious disease, so the movement of people is very important for understanding the spread of Ebola. It would have been very helpful if the public health community could have had access to data about movement of people in these countries after the outbreak began. There were cell phone companies that had data from call records that would have provided a proxy for information about movement of people. There were researchers who were capable of analyzing this data and willing to analyze this data, but they never received access to the data in a timely fashion because there were questions about the legality and the ethics of making this data available to these researchers. So I think there's a way that that project could have been done in an ethically responsible manner, and that would have been very helpful to people fighting against the epidemic. And so more generally, I think there are lots of things that we should be excited about doing if we could develop shared procedures and norms about ethics. And then the final reason that we should care about ethics is I think we have no choice. In my experience doing this research, people are very close to the edge of what is acceptable and not acceptable. It just happens a lot in this field. I don't really know why exactly. And so many of you in your work are going to run into questions like this. And so you need to be prepared so that you can do your work responsibly. So what I think has been a big change that's leading to some of these ethical challenges is that in the past, really what we could do was a major limitation for social scientists. There was just a lot of stuff we couldn't do. And increasingly, the limitation will be what we should do. So our capabilities have expanded. This is one of the things we were all very excited about. Oh, now we can get data about the behavior of millions of people. Oh, now we can run experiments without people knowing about that. It's a huge increase in our capability. And so increasingly, we're going to have to decide what is the responsible way to use that capability. And I phrased it that way very intentionally because just because this capability can be misused does not mean it shouldn't be used for good, right? So we have to decide as our power increases, we have to decide how to use that power responsibly. And fortunately, we are not starting from scratch. These are problems that people have been thinking about for, depending on how you count, hundreds of years. And so we have a lot of good ideas that we can draw from. So with what we do today, I want to be able to help you design ethically thoughtful research, and then also explain your decisions to others. And this second step, I think, is particularly important because I think a lot of the problems that I see in the debates that I see about ethics are in part because of misunderstanding and poor communication. And so the better we are able to communicate with each other about these issues, the more we can avoid misunderstandings. And also, I think the better we will get at this. So in lots of other parts of research, we believe that discussion and debate leads to improvement. That's kind of what science is about. And I think it's the same thing for ethics. Right now, we have many people facing very complicated and hard decisions, doing it without the benefit of having open discussion and debate. And so I think if we're going to make progress, the more open discussion and debate will eventually get to better solutions faster. So these are the goals for today. So for today, I'm going to talk a lot about what's in bit by bit. But going forward, I'll be assuming that you've read the chapter. But today, you just got here, so some of you may not have read it. So I'll say some stuff that's not in the book as well. Also, about questions. So we haven't had any questions yet from people here in the room. We haven't had any questions yet from people in the live stream. If you have a question, just raise your hand and ask your question. We all know how that works. If you have a question on the live stream, there is a Slack channel that's called Questions for Speakers. You can put your question in there. There's Janet is here, and she will be moderating that, and she will ask the question on your behalf. If you're not yet on the Slack, ask your local organizer, and we'll get you on the Slack, and we'll start having more questions from everyone. OK? Any questions now? Great. So I want to talk about 3 different styles that people use to approach ethics. And the first style that I see a lot is very common among social scientists, and I would call this the rules-based approach. And so basically, they decide what is ethical and what is not ethical based on certain rules, particularly the rules that are enforced by IRBs. So I should also say that my experience talking about rules and so on is very influenced by the US context, where the IRBs follow a certain set of rules. I know that in other countries, they follow different rules. There are different systems. I don't know very much about those other systems. So this is sort of a US-centric view of this, and I apologize for that. One of the problems with the rules-based approach is that these rules were created a long time ago. They were created before a lot of the capabilities that currently exist were around. And so they were really designed for a different age. And I think increasingly we'll find that any rules-based approach, no matter how modern and well updated, will continually lag behind what is possible. It just takes too long to update the rules. Like if you think about in the US, the rules that govern the IRB, the common rule, took them many, many years to update them. They just finished this process. So it's just impractical to think that the rules are going to keep up with the capabilities. The second approach is what I would call an ad hoc approach, which is sort of each researcher kind of thinks about it a little bit and says, oh, this is OK with me. I'm going to do it. This is, I would say, a little bit more common in the data science community, where they're not as familiar working with IRBs. It's not as much a part of their tradition. And so this approach has problems as well. It has problems that it's hard for you as an individual researcher to make the right decision without a community sort of helping you think through these problems. And it also has a problem for researchers in that you are really exposed and out on your own. So if you have gone through some third-party oversight and something goes wrong or people disagree with you, having gone through that process provides you a huge amount of protection. And if you do not have that, you may wish you had done that should something happen. So there are limitations to this ad hoc approach. And what I'm going to advocate for is something different, which is what I would call a principles-based approach. And so I think this solves some of the problems with the rules-based approach or the ad hoc approach. So the idea is that our capabilities are changing very quickly. The rules can't keep up. So we should reason about what we should do from principles that are sort of one step more abstract than rules. And then these principles will also help us communicate with each other. So if I'm doing a study and Chris disagrees with something that I'm doing, he might say, hey, Matt, why did you do that? And I would say, well, the principle of beneficence suggests that these are the things we should consider, and here's how I consider them. And Chris would say, okay, and now I understand the principle of beneficence is how you're thinking about it. So that is the idea. It helps you think about things for which rules have not yet been created, and it helps you communicate. So I want to give 3 examples of real sort of computational social science research projects that have run into ethical, been the subject of ethical debate, and we'll use these to illustrate some of the themes that come up later. But I think having some examples helps illustrate some of the more general ideas. I also want to be clear that I think none of the researchers who were doing these thought they were doing anything wrong when they were doing it. And they were very surprised when other people were less excited about the research. So I think, and I also don't think any of them had bad intentions. Like, I don't think any of them set out to do something wrong. I think that it just is hard to make these decisions, and it's hard to anticipate how people will respond to what you've done. So the first is emotional contagion. Many of you probably know about this study. In brief, so it's also very hard to describe all of these studies fairly in like 2 or 3 sentences. So I get to say this now. You can read, all the details are in the book. I'm just going to summarize them as quickly as I can. So emotional contagion, in this experiment, researchers from a university partnered with researchers from Facebook and did an experiment where they manipulated the news feed of about, well, there were 700,000 participants. In some cases, posts that had positive words were probabilistically blocked from the feed. In some cases, posts that had negative words were probabilistically blocked from the feed. And then they studied the kinds of words people used in their posts subsequently. So some of the debate around this was that this was an experiment. There was not informed consent in the way that social scientists normally think about informed consent, although it was potentially consistent with Facebook's terms of service. There are questions about whether this went through an appropriate review procedure. There are questions about whether this is a treatment that should be deployed at a large scale, given that there's potential for harm, especially to maybe a certain small subset of people. So there are many more arguments about this. Oh yeah, question?
So I think one of the reasons that the researchers were not worried about the consequences is that this is done every day in Facebook. So the question becomes, how can we talk about this, what Facebook does on a daily basis? Is that our concern as social scientists or not?
That is a great question. I want to also generalize this, because not just Facebook where these things are happening all the time. So how should we think about that? So this will actually be part of the activity, is a study that you all will get to discuss where this same issue arises, that there is a certain thing that's happening in everyday business practice, and if a researcher engages in that thing, is that appropriate or not? There are different ways of thinking about it. So one way of thinking about it is, we are researchers, and we should try to follow a higher standard, and we shouldn't be in a race to the bottom with whatever some company will do. So companies are bound by laws, and we as researchers should have higher standards than just those laws. A counter argument is, well, these people are doing this stuff anyway, and there's not public good coming from it. And if we were doing those same things, we were publishing our results, and public good is coming from it. And so you're preventing us from doing something that's routinely done. And that's limiting our ability to create knowledge for the future. I personally find this to be one of the hardest issues, and it's actually one that goes back to the origins of research ethics in the social sciences. So a sort of foundational document in the US was called the Belmont Report. So there was a blue ribbon commission created by the US Congress, largely in response to the Tuskegee syphilis study, but other studies as well. And the US Congress said, okay, we need to have some kind of oversight, or we can't have this stuff happening. Can you create this commission? The commission can come up with rules or principles. As the commission came up with principles, which then got turned into rules. But one of the things in that document at the beginning is they separate everyday practice from research. And they say everyday practice is not something that's governed by our document. So what I think, though, is that a lot of the ideas that guide research can help us guide everyday business practice. And I think it's possible that some of the things that are everyday business practice we might not really think are appropriate. And if we then are in these companies, we can advocate for the kind of research and science that we think is right. So hopefully maybe some of these principles will help explain and communicate to other people why maybe you feel uncomfortable about a certain thing that's happening. That's a great question. And feel free to ask more questions, too. So that's emotional contagion. Another example is called Taste, Ties, and Time. This was a project where some sociologists scraped a bunch of data from Facebook and then combined it with administrative records from a university. They used this to do some very interesting research that was published in leading journals. Then they attempted to de-identify the data, and with the approval of their IRB, they made it available to other researchers. However, someone else figured out that the data was not as de-identified as they had thought, and so they had to pull the data off, and that data is no longer accessible. So this is not an experiment, right? This is a purely observational thing, but it involves issues related to privacy, which is another thing that comes up, even if you are not doing experiments. And then finally, this is a project by a computer scientist, and the idea was to try to measure the amount of internet censorship around the world. So certain governments prevent people from accessing certain parts of the internet. These internet censorship things, they're changing all the time, and it would be very nice to have a sort of global map of internet censorship. One way to do this would be to put researchers inside of these countries, or devices inside of these countries, that would then try to hit different parts of the internet, but then those devices or people who are doing that are potentially at risk. So what they figured out a way to do is, if you would visit a certain web page, let's say the Summer Institute webpage, for example, we could put a little piece of code in the Summer Institute webpage that would trigger an HTTP request to a certain website, and then would report back to the researchers whether that request was successful or not. So, and if you happen to be visiting our website from, let's say, Canada, it would run this request, and then it would say, okay, from Canada, you're able to access YouTube. And if you happen to be visiting from Iran, it would do this request. The request would fail. I believe YouTube is censored in Iran now, I'm not sure. But there is some country where YouTube is censored. If you were in one of those countries, then the request would fail. And so through this system, they're generating a bunch of data. Now, the question is, so they've sort of essentially used your computer to do a measurement about internet censorship without your awareness. So this is another sort of not an experiment, but also a potentially complicated issue. And each of those cases are described in much more detail in the book. So we'll use these as sort of running examples to talk about the different principles that arise. So I'm going to skip. We had an idea that we would all think of some new examples, but in the interest of time, I think I'm going to skip that. So Yeah, as I said, in each of these cases, the researchers did not intend to do something bad. In all of them, I think they had really good intentions, but they sort of got mixed up into something they didn't want to be mixed up in. And I think the problem, again, is this, what I said before, is we have increasing power. We have the capability to observe the behavior of millions of people without their consent and without their awareness. We have the capability of enrolling millions of people in experiments without their consent and without their awareness. And at the same time that our power is increasing, there is a lot of ambiguity about how we should be using that power. The norms and rules and expectations are incredibly inconsistent. Should researchers follow the same rules that people in companies follow? Should they follow different rules? What if your research involves multiple countries? Like Encore, for example, involve people in like more than 100 countries. So what are the expectations about browser behavior in all of those countries? Very, very difficult. So this is, I think, sort of at a fundamental level the problem that we face. And I think, fortunately, we have good ideas to fall back on for helping us manage this sort of possible problem. And so I talked at the beginning about a principles-based approach. So let me explain how I think this fits into sort of broader framework. So there are rules. These are very specific things. So if you think about like the IRB in the US, there's like 8 elements that need to be in a consent document. And they're listed. Those are rules. They're very specific. They can be enforced by a third party. Those rules, though, all are derived from principles, which are like, so for example, the idea of informed consent is derived from the principle of respect for persons, but the principle of respect for persons is more general. Helps you think about other kinds of situations. It doesn't tell you these are the 8 elements of informed consent, but it helps you think about maybe more general ideas about what if you can't get consent, what should you do? Are there other things that you can do to honor this idea of respect for persons? And then, in fact, these principles are themselves generally derived from 2 sort of more abstract ethical frameworks that philosophers have been arguing about for a long time, consequentialism and deontology. And so we'll see the ability to move back and forth between this very specific stuff, this slightly more general stuff, and this even more general stuff will give us a way of thinking about projects differently and will hopefully give us a way of communicating better and helping us make decisions when we have hard decisions that we have to make. So I want to talk briefly about the principles. So here, now I did not make up any of these principles, which is great. So when I started actually working on the book, I thought, oh, I'll just like make up some principles. And then I realized that is really, really hard. And I was like, well, what am I going to do? And it turns out that like a lot of people have worked on this for a long time. And the Belmont Report, I think, is magnificent. It's very short. It's like 20 pages. If you haven't read it, I really would recommend reading it. And then I would also recommend checking out the appendices. There are 2 700-page appendices. And so when I was like thinking I would write my own principles, I looked at those appendices and I was like, all right, I mean, they had like teams of people working for years. It's amazing. All right, so I want to talk to you about sort of those 1,400 pages of appendices and thousands of human hours got boiled down into these 3 principles. The first is respect for persons. And so this is the idea, basically, that participants decide and not you. So you should respect the autonomy of people. And this is the principle from which informed consent usually follows. So if you're doing something to someone and they're not playing a role in deciding what you're doing to them, that's generally not a good thing. The second principle is beneficence. And so this is about, I really like to think of this as 2 steps. So you want to minimize the risks and maximize the benefits. And those are largely technical things. So minimizing the risk, have you screened out people who may be particularly sensitive to this? Do you have a system for tracking adverse events? Should some harm come, do you have a system in place to connect people to resources to help them? These are largely technical things. Is your experiment appropriately designed to minimize the number of participants you need? Again, a technical thing. Then, once you've done all this minimizing and maximizing, then you have a decision at the end, is this appropriate? And so that second decision is not a technical decision. That's an ethical decision. And it requires different mindset, and I think it also requires different skills than the first. So for example, I have in the past served on an IRB. Let me just clarify, I'm not speaking on behalf of the IRB. I'm totally speaking on behalf of myself. And on our IRB, there was a minister. And so this minister was not particularly good at the technical issues of experimental design and whether certain things were minimized or maximized appropriately. But he was very good at saying, OK, given this, let's think about whether this is an appropriate balance. And so really, there are different skills required for different parts of this process. And as an individual researcher, you'll really need to be able to do all of this. The third principle is justice. And this is about thinking about the distribution of the benefits and burdens of the research. So you could argue that this is embedded in beneficence, but I think they pulled it out as a separate principle, especially because of the history of research ethics. So if you look at a lot of the worst examples of researchers behaving badly, it almost always involves disadvantaged people. So there's poorly educated and disenfranchised citizens, there's prisoners, there's institutionalized and mentally disabled children, and there's old and debilitated hospital patients. So this is a really awful list, but it seems that the people who get abused by researchers are generally not healthy professors or graduate students. It's often other people. And so the people doing the Belmont Report decided to explicitly flag this. And so if you're in a situation where the people who are participants in your research are particularly disadvantaged, and the people who benefit from your research are, let's say, not those people, but are wealthy people. So in the medical ethics history, it used to be like studies would be done on orphans and prisoners, and they would develop medical knowledge, and then that knowledge would not be available to those people. Like only wealthy people were able to have access to that, the treatments that were developed. So this is generally something you want to watch out for. Now, the thing about justice that's tricky is there's a debate about how we should think about justice. So one way to think about it is we want to protect disadvantaged people from being in research. But then the other side of that is we also want to make sure that they have access to research, the knowledge that comes from research. So in the US, for example, if we were to say, in medical trials, for example, you might say, oh, we shouldn't do medical trials involving pregnant women because that adds to the risk and we want to not do that. But then pregnant women are denied the benefits of the knowledge that is created from that kind of research. And so there are a number of disadvantaged populations, not pregnant women, but other disadvantaged populations where there's this balance between the knowledge is very valuable to them. And so you want to make sure that all groups have access to the knowledge that comes from research happening on their group. So this is part of the justice, the balance between protection and access. Question?
Yeah, that was almost exactly my question.
Oh, great.
I guess, well, maybe just to follow up, I think with digital research, there is sort of a skew towards populations that are well represented in the media we study. So I was wondering kind of what you came across as you were researching about that, about studying people who aren't connected to the internet or not on these platforms.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, and it's in some ways it's a scientific question, right? We'll talk more when we talk about digital trace data, about non-representative data. I think it's also, to some extent, an ethical question in thinking about who benefits from the research. So one argument about emotional contagion, for example, is that the people who benefit from the research were people who use Facebook, and the people who were the participants were people that use Facebook. And so there you have this nice balance between the people who can benefit and the people who can participate. So other questions? And so those three come from the Belmont Report. And then in the more recently, so the Belmont Report was written in the 70s. More recently, researchers in computer science, particularly security, started encountering problems when they had ethical decisions involving, they call them ICT systems, basically computing technology. So for example, people who study bots that like take over and do distributed denial of service attacks. Is it okay for you to like hack into a bot and take it over for research purposes? People who study phishing, so that like people trying to steal stuff from you in different ways. You could imagine a researcher might want to do phishing to learn about how phishing works. Or you could imagine a researcher might want to go onto the darknet and see how much people are selling stolen credit card numbers. There's all kinds of stuff that a researcher might want to do that involve mixing with complicated ethical things. And so they created a new Blue Ribbon Commission. This one was actually created by the Department of Homeland Security, which tells you a little bit about the origins of some of these problems. And this commission sort of was the first, I think, to deal with research ethics in the sort of digital age. It brought in a lot more of computer science. And so what they did is they sort of reaffirmed the three Belmont principles and then added this fourth principle, respect for law and public interest. So I want to explain briefly what that one is. So it involves two things. It involves compliance, so basically following the law. And second, transparency-based accountability. And so in this computer security field, there were people who were doing stuff and were keeping their own identity secret. So there was a researcher who hacked into something and then dumped all the data online anonymously. And so this created a situation where there was no accountability. You could argue, and the researcher did argue, like there was a reason to do this, and he argued or she argued that it was in the best interest of the community, but then because he or she was anonymous, there was no accountability for that decision. So respect for law and public interest involves these two parts. This comes up a lot with terms of service agreements. So for those of you who do web scraping, there's often a question about whether this is appropriate or allowed, because often companies do not want you to scrape the data. There are many ways of thinking about this, but this is an example of the kind of thing that comes up in respect for law and public interest. Here's a paper that does a good job of dealing with this, I think. This is a paper called MapWatch. So what they're interested in is sort of monitoring the behavior of large companies, particularly in how they display maps. So a lot of political information. Maps are a very political decision. And so what they wanted to do was see if companies were displaying the same maps to everyone or whether they were displaying different maps to different people. So here's a description. I've put this in just so you can read it later. So they created basically like a bot that would go and query for different maps from different IP addresses. And so this is the border around Crimea. And if you query, this is from Bing. If you query, Google Maps. If you query from inside Russia, you see this line here, indicating that Crimea is separate from the rest of Ukraine. If you query from inside of Ukraine, you do not see that line. And if you query everywhere else, you see this like dotted line, which is kind of ambiguous. Yeah?
What should I? Hi.
Yeah,
so I just wanted to make a small addition, very small addition, that now it's illegal in Russia to say that Crimea is not a part of Russia.
Okay.
So that's partially the reason why, for example, Yandex and probably Google as well, they have to comply to the laws.
Yes.
So it's not just like fantasy, and for anybody actually. So if you're in Russia, you say that Crimea is not Russian. It's literally a criminal like
Yes.
thing.
So they're not they are not necessarily meaning to say that Google is doing something wrong here. Yeah. Yes. Yes, absolutely. So there are a lot of reasons why this may happen, and it also shows, I think, the difficulties that companies have when they're working in environments all over the world. So just like researchers have a responsibility to follow the laws, companies have a responsibility to follow the laws, and that can create tension. What I like about this paper, though, is here they have very explicitly in the paper an ethics section, and they say very clearly why they violated the terms of service. So they don't hide it. They don't pretend like they're not doing it. They're like, we're going to violate the terms of service, and here's why. And we have a paper about why we've done it, and then we can have a discussion, and people can decide that this was inappropriate, and normal academic channels can help make that happen, or people can decide that this is appropriate, and people can then cite this paper as a precedent, and we can make progress. Yeah, sure.
So this might be very specific to how they violated services, terms of services. So what did the terms of services exactly say? Like, how did they violate it? So sometimes you see like you cannot scrape anything, or sometimes they say you cannot scrape anything that is like putting too much like load on the website that
Yes.
like would not function.
So I do not know the details of the actual terms of service or how they violated it, but I would definitely recommend checking out the paper. Here's the link to the paper, and also this paper here, they go into much more detail about their reasoning for that. And obviously this would have to be decided on a case-by-case basis, and this doesn't mean, let me just also be clear, I'm not saying you should just feel free to violate terms of service. What I am saying, though, is that often what you will see is that these principles come into conflict with each other. So you may say, oh, I should follow the laws and I should follow terms of service, but you might also say, well, there's a beneficence argument that potentially outweighs this. Or often you see respect for persons and beneficence in conflict. That is, sometimes there's research that you could do without people's consent that would potentially have a lot of benefit for society. You don't have their consent, so those principles are in conflict. And so what you should expect is lots of times these principles will be in conflict, and then you have to be able to, on a case-by-case basis, reason about how you should come up with an appropriate balance, how you should change your research design to minimize these conflicts, and then once you've got the best possible design, what you think is appropriate, what kind of third-party guidance you want, and so on. And so you'll get practice doing that this afternoon with some case studies. Okay. So how do you do the balancing is really, to me, the key. But a first step is noticing the different dimensions. So if you're expecting these principles to tell you what to do, then you're going to be disappointed. Sorry. There is no like algorithm to tell you what is ethical. But I think that these help us see the different dimensions. So to make an example from coding, right? Sometimes there's ways of doing things that use more RAM, and sometimes there's ways that use more CPU, and sometimes there's ways that use more hard drive. And like, depending on what your situation is, you have to find the right balance of those things for what you need to do. And so I think here, again, these are the different dimensions along which research can vary, and you have to find the right balance for your situation. One way to often think about these is through these more general frameworks of consequentialism and deontology. So there are many, many books written about these, and I will summarize them in one sentence. So if there are any philosophers here, please, I apologize. Consequentialism is most associated with people like Mill and Bentham. It's more like utilitarianism. So roughly, you think about the ends. Like, does this lead to good ends? Are the pluses more than the minuses? Deontology, more associated with people like Kant, is much more focused on the means. So even if you get a good outcome, did it happen through a good means? And so a lot of the research ethics debates, I think, are really fundamentally more about this focus on means and focus on ends. And I think a lot of researchers focus on ends. They say, oh, this will be so great if I do this. Think how much knowledge will be created. And other people will say, but look at the means. Look at what you're doing. You're doing things to people without their consent. And so we need to be able to think about both means and ends. And we also need to remember that both of these lead to really, taken to their extremes, can lead to really unusual decisions. So the most sort of in consequentialism, there's this idea that like if we should just, let's say Chris, for example, Chris has many healthy organs. And so we should just take him over to the hospital, cut him up, and give his organs. We could save like 5 people, at least, with all of the great organs that Chris has. And so you just add up the benefits and the costs. Like, we should do it. So obviously, that is not something that we should do. And just, I had to get that out there. And so you can see that focusing on the ends without paying attention to the means can lead you to some very silly things. Likewise, completely ignoring the ends, only focusing on the means and not paying attention to the ends can lead to other problems. So for example, let's imagine that Chris was an evil terrorist and he had put a bomb somewhere on campus, a deontologist, and let's say we could trick him into revealing the location of this bomb by lying to him. So a deontologist might say, oh, you shouldn't lie to someone. That's not an appropriate way of getting this information. But I think we might be willing to lie to Chris if this would save the lives of everyone on campus, for example. So again, both approaches lead to weird decisions, but keeping them both in balance, I think, will help you avoid ending up at either one of these uncomfortable extremes. So just to reinforce this consequentialism deontology distinction, I'm going to give you a little example, and then you're going to, this is like a mini pop quiz, okay? So this is a paper about emotional contagion, and these authors argued the following. Even if it is true that the risks for the Facebook experiment were low, and even if in hindsight the results were judged to be useful, there is an important principle at stake here that must be upheld. In the same way that stealing is stealing, no matter what amounts are involved, so we all have a right not to be experimented on without our knowledge and consent, whatever the nature of the research. So do you think this person is arguing more from a consequentialist position or a deontological position? So you're going to show me on your fingers, 1 or 2. Okay? So I'm going to 3, 2, 1, go, and then you're all going to vote. Okay, ready? 3, 2, 1, go. Great. This is very much a deontological argument. And now, if you were going to be in a discussion with this person, the natural response to this is not to make a consequentialist argument. This will fail. This is what I see all the time. It's like, oh, yeah, but look at all the good that happened. Like, this is not the way to do it. And if you are yourself more deontological and someone else is arguing from a consequentialist frame, switching frames without making that clear to the other person you're talking to is not going to work. It's like you're arguing about one thing, they're arguing about a different thing, and you're not going to make any progress. So during the afternoon when you work on these activities, you'll have a chance to discuss some cases, and my guess is like different people will be more consequentialist or deontological, and as you switch arguments, try to make sure you're aware and make sure the other person knows, I understand you're worried about the means, but let's look at the ends for 1 second and think about that. So you can make these transitions clear if you're doing them in your head to the person that you're talking to. So that's a little bit of the ways of moving away from the rules to think about the principles that they came from, and then even more of these ethical frameworks. And again, moving back and forth will help us think about specific pieces of research and will help us communicate our reasoning to others. So now actually applying these is going to be difficult. And so we'll see 4 areas of particular problem after the break. And there are some questions.
you hear me? This is a question from Andrew at the NYU location. Andrew wants to know if your own research on ethics went through an IRB process. And when do we need to think about going through an IRB, and when should we assume we are exempt?
Okay. Okay. So there are rules that so this is specific to the US. If you're not in the US, I don't know how it works in wherever you are. But you should understand sort of when third-party oversight is appropriate and when it's not. So in the US, there's a very clear definition about research involving human subjects seeking generalizable knowledge. Each of those terms has specific definitions. In this case, this research is reading papers and books. There's no, humans are not involved except through these people who have created these obviously are humans, but there's no original human subjects research in what I've done here. Now the question is, when should you seek third-party guidance is maybe a more general question. So I think to the extent that you are uncomfortable, you should seek third-party guidance. So I've had people come to me, I've had people say, oh, I'm doing this thing, and I'm not sure I really want to go to the IRB with this thing. And then I'm like, oh, then you definitely need to go to the IRB. Because if you are uncomfortable, then that is a sign that you need third-party oversight. So that is a rule that I tried to follow. But also I want to be clear that the IRB is not the end. The IRB is not the ultimate source of truth and justice and wisdom and all these other things. So even if the IRB approves a certain piece of research, that doesn't necessarily mean that that piece of research is appropriate. And there are real limits to what the IRB can do because they don't have the same level of expertise that you do about what you're doing. You are the world's expert in what you are doing. And so you have the most information about that context, and you have the most information about how to minimize the risks. You have the most information about how to maximize the benefits. And so a lot of that responsibility should fall on you, not just the IRB.
Matt, I just wanted to chime in and encourage people to reach out to your IRB officer and have a preliminary conversation about your research. We tend to, and I think this is a theme that Matt's hitting on, we have a kind of defensive stance vis-a-vis IRB, but many of these people are in fact skilled and can help you think through these things. So approach them early and often. I just wanted to chime in. Thanks.
Is there another question from the... Okay. Any more questions? Oh.
Thank you. I think the question of consenting to be part in an experiment is really interesting. I just saw a talk on public support for policy experiments. So one of the examples was a hospital has 2 interventions that could get physicians to sanitize their hands, but they don't know which one is better. And so when you ask people, they all support just implementing either one of them, but they're really opposed to randomizing physicians to one or the other. And some of the reasons were that even if the physician consents, the patients are the ones affected and they couldn't consent. And then many people think you should not at all do research with humans or in hospitals, which is, of course, where all the research gets done. So what do you think about this?
Yeah, so I think consent is a very tricky area. And that's one of these 4 areas we'll talk more about next time. But I want to highlight one thing that you said, which I think comes up much more in computational social science than in traditional social science research ethics. And that is the involvement of non-participants. So in the research ethics tradition that we have is sort of, you can think of like a Psych 101 style experiment where someone comes into a room, close the door of that room, the only person being impacted is that person. A lot of computational social science happens more in the wild, these kinds of field experiments. There you have the possibility that non-participants can be impacted. So it's not even clear who you would want to get consent from. That issue also comes up in one of the case studies that you'll discuss this afternoon. But again, this is an important thing about going beyond the rules. The rules focus on getting consent from participants because the rules come from this earlier era. And now we have to think about the effects of what we're doing on non-participants and on the systems we're engaging in more generally. Yeah, okay.
Can you speak more about the balancing process for when these principles conflict, which is often or always the case?
That is a really hard thing. You're a lawyer, right? So maybe, so my understanding, so I tried to read some about law and how they do these balancing tests. And as best I could understand, in the end, kind of a judge decides. And so I think the way that I try to think about it myself is if these things are in conflict, I try to think of it, there's like a full range of possible things. And do you know this like idea of, I forgot what it's called in economics, there's like a curve, and you could be anywhere on this curve. You definitely want to be at the most extreme thing possible. Yeah. And so like, can you design it so that you've done the best you can at respect for persons and the best you can at beneficence, let's say. And then there are different places along this curve that you could be. Like you could say, like, I really don't want to do an experiment without someone's consent. And so, and I don't care how much benefit is going to come from that. Like the hand washing example in the hospital, let's say. You might say, I just don't want to do that. Or you could say, well, I'm really focused on beneficence. I really think there's a lot of good, and I'm willing to only do it with the consent of the doctors. Or maybe I'm willing to do it with the consent of the doctors and the hospital. Or maybe I'll do it with the consent of the doctors and the hospital, and I'll publicly advertise it to the patients so that they can opt out if they want. Or I'll do it with the consent of a random sample of patients or something. Like there's a huge range of things. So I try to think about what that range is. Because with most research designs, there's a lot of different possibilities. And once you start thinking about all those possibilities, often you can find a way to help bring the balance into better, you can help improve the balance. So I think a lot of these difficulties can be resolved in the design stage if you can be if you can be more creative. Yep.
So I wanted to ask, and maybe this is a better question for tomorrow as well, since we're working on this, but I wanted to see if like anyone in the room or even you like had any thoughts about general principles around to scrape or not to scrape, which I think is like a common issue. And I think it's complicated, right, by like two main things. Like one being the fact that access to proprietary data is unequal. So some folks have access to and some don't. And then there's the issue of conflict of interest, right? When you directly reach out to a proprietary source, like asking for that data, and then perhaps they want to collaborate with you, but then your interests are not necessarily aligned. So like maybe we could crowdsource like principles around
Sure. So I think that's a great question. I think maybe Chris will talk about that.
Right behind you.
Oh, good. He's already ready.
Yeah, we are going to talk about that tomorrow when we get into digital trace data. Short answer is respect the terms of service, not only because it's the law, but also because you might find yourself in the situation where years from now you would receive a cease and desist letter and couldn't, for example, be able to publish your dissertation. So there are obviously gray areas, but better safe than sorry.
And I will say we will deal with that a little bit in one of the case studies as well, this unequal access and scraping and alternative ways of getting data access. Oh, we have a question from the live stream.
Question from NYU. This one is from Hamid. He wants to ask how you think about how informed consent changes, the fact that informed consent can change the natural behavior that we intend to study, and how to think about balancing these two issues.
That's a great question. And I would say here it's a case where respect for persons and beneficence, you may see these principles as being somewhat in conflict. That is, the respect for persons, you want to get consent from people before something happens, but that may change their behavior. So that may decrease what can be learned appropriately from the study. And so then you see this potential tension between beneficence and respect for persons. So there I would say there are a number of ways that you can address that. Sometimes psychologists have developed systems where they essentially get consent from people afterwards. So you so you get some basic consent from them without telling them exactly what the study is about. And then when the study is over, you can tell them what it's about. And if a lot of people seem to be objecting after they hear what the study is about, that's information that you can use to adjust your design or change your consent process. So there are ways of potentially addressing that problem. But it is a real issue for sure. Yeah?
So I have a question actually related to the previous point. That's why I wanted to ask. It's a very narrow applied question about scraping and how to read terms of service. So, so for example, if terms of service says that you can scrape this amount of data from one account, and this is actually a real discussion I had with some people. So, but it doesn't say how many accounts you can have. You understand what I'm saying?
Yes,
so,
I understand what you're saying.
Because to me it looks like you can set up 15 accounts and it's fine. But like they say that it's implied that one person has one account, but it didn't say anything about this explicitly. So I don't know what is the right answer. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So I would say there's a couple things. So first of all, I'm not a lawyer, and so I can't speak to the actual details of any terms of service. But I think when you're evaluating a term, when you're thinking about scraping, you want to think about what are the rules, and then you also want to think about what is the intent of the other party. And so, for example, I think we all agree that you don't want to crash their website by having a scraper go wild, right? Like there are certain things that you want to do to respect them. So I think, those are the two issues. What is the... I don't. Okay, good. All right. So what is the law and what is the intent and how does that fit into... Because it could potentially depend on how you want to use the data. It could depend on a lot of things. And so we'll talk more about that, I guess, when Chris talks some about scraping. And these are also, I think, a good kind of thing that we can talk about at lunch. So, and dinner and so on. Many of you had experience doing these things. Many of you have thought about them deeply. And so we can all sort of work together to learn from each other. But I think there are no easy answers for sure.
Yeah, we could do that. And I would just want to tell everyone we're running about 10 minutes past on this section, so we should probably wrap up.
All right, so let's wrap it up then. And we'll move on to the next section where we talk about these 4 areas in more detail. So let's take a 2-minute break, and we'll move to the next section. And we'll have more time for questions and discussion then. So thank you.